Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you so much for joining me here in the rain. And thank you so much to the Chautauqua Institution for inviting me to speak. I remember when I got the email and I was like, really, me? So I am really honored to be here in the company of all of you seekers and in the company of all of the other speakers and the people that I have met today. Several years ago, I cared for a patient who I'll call Andrew. He was in his 30s, around my age at the time. Over the span of several months, a cancer that began as a spot on his cheek took on a life of its own. He'd been in terrible pain and terribly depressed, which is why his cancer physician called and asked me to help treat these symptoms. When I first met him, his nurse unwrapped the bandages so I could see his wounds and so she could clean them. It was hard to look at the surface of the tumor that broke through the surface of his cheek like gnarled weeds pushing through a bed of daisies. Alternately pink and gray and brown, the tumor had replaced part of his face. It is gruesome, I remember thinking, the way our own cells orchestrate their death, the way our own bodies destroy us. He couldn't chew, and he had a feeding tube in his abdomen. He'd been in and out of the hospital because of infections caused by chemotherapy. He struggled to speak to me. Andrew was dying of his cancer, which had disfigured his face, and he told me, rendered his life unrecognizable. He stretched his hand towards me when I first introduced myself in that hospital room. "Help me," he said. I'm a palliative care doctor. Because most people, whether it's colleagues or patients and their families, don't know what that means, I have learned to interpret my purpose. I am trained to see and to ease the suffering that accompanies illness, dying, and death. That means that sometimes I get to know people right when they've been diagnosed with a cancer or heart failure or Alzheimer's. I get to know who they are and what matters to them and to the people who love them as they get sicker. I treat their pain or their shortness of breath, and I help find language to talk about the unspeakable, what they really mean when they tell me that they are a fighter and that they are going to beat the odds, or what they are really hoping for when they tell me that they're awaiting a miracle. Other times I never hear their voices because some of the people I meet and care for are in the ICU, on life support, and unable to speak with me. And so I instead speak with their families and guide them through that liminal landscape between life and death, a place marked with uncertainty, a place I have come to know well, a place they are encountering for the first time. And while my role is technically that of a physician, the experiences of illness, suffering, dying, and death are about much more than Western biomedicine. As people face mortality, the realizations that they grapple with have always been and still are spiritual and existential. As our bodies change and as our illnesses advance, we see acutely that everything we thought we were changes and begins to fall away in the same manner that leaves once fluorescent burn crimson in the fall and carpet the ground beneath us. We may lose our ability to walk. We may lose our awareness of the world around us. We lose our appetites and we leave our jobs. Our relationships change. And we begin to ask ourselves questions with no easy answers. Who am I now that I am sick? What does my life mean? What do I mean to others, and what do they mean to me? How will I go on? Absolutely nothing in my training prepared me for this dimension of my role as a physician. In residency, I spoke of suffering with people, but invoked it in really superficial ways. If someone, for example, had been in the ICU on a ventilator for many weeks, I'd wonder aloud if maybe our efforts were simply prolonging suffering, by which I really meant prolonging the inevitable. I had no way of understanding what their suffering was like, because words like suffering and dignity and mortality and even peace were not part, and still are not adequately a part, of Western medical education. I knew intellectually that suffering was not just physical. I knew it was emotional, I knew it was psychological, expressed through emotions as varied as rage and stoicism. But I thought my job was to protect people from their suffering by treating their pain and other symptoms, but also by stopping their tears, by easing their anger, by soothing their anguish, by directing them away from it, not engaging with it. I thought that if I could save the body, that I could save them. I could save their lives, and that would be the way to spare them suffering. I was particularly interested in protecting them from death, which of course was shot through with the greatest suffering we as humans come to know. Dying meant losing the proverbial battle with disease. We no longer exist, right? We lose the people we love. They will never stop grieving us. In my training, if I was taking care of somebody and they grew sicker despite my efforts, I believed that I'd failed that person and the people who loved them. Death was my failure. Mortality was optional. But one night, a man in his 60s with colon cancer under my watch at night in the hospital suffered a sudden cardiac arrest and his heart stopped. I spent 45 minutes directing CPR efforts, and our team sighed with relief when his heart started to beat again. My supervisor praised my work. My patient's family gathered around him, whispering how much they loved him, taping photos of vacations and grandchildren in the walls of his room, playing hymns off of Spotify on his iPhone. He spent several weeks in the ICU under my watch. I manipulated the ventilator, his medications, his vital signs. He eventually opened his eyes, but they were vacant and he couldn't speak. He couldn't recognize or interact with the people he loved. What had I saved? Who had I saved? He hadn't died, but I hadn't saved him. Shortly before he left the hospital, I sat next to him, leaned in, and told him that I was sorry. I had lost my compass. Years before I became a doctor, when I was a child, I'd learned that death was not a failure, nor was it the end. Death was a lesson, a teacher. I am the daughter of deeply spiritual Hindu parents. My mother is an anesthesiologist, and my father is an engineer. Both grew up terribly poor and in India left ravaged in the wake of India's partition post-independence and from the British Empire. But they found purpose and grounding in their Hindu faith, in which they immersed my brother and me. Science and spirituality, they said, were complementary, not polar opposites. In order to practice medicine, I had to find a way to move forward in my training while returning to the lessons that my parents taught me, many of which came from the Hindu scripture, the Bhagavad Gita. The great Hindu epic poem, the Mahabharata, tells the story of two sets of cousins in Kurukshetra in northern India. These two sets of cousins fought for control of that kingdom of Kurukshetra. The Pandavas, made up of 5 brothers, including the masterful warrior Arjuna, lived righteously and truthfully, whereas their 100 cousins, the Kauravas, were deceitful, full of pride, willing to lie to and cheat the Pandavas to gain control of the kingdom. But the two sides eventually went to war, a battle which came to symbolize the clash of good and evil for control of the world. But on the first day of battle, Arjuna looked across the battlefield at the people comprising the Kauravas and their army. They were his cousins, They were his friends. They were his teachers, the ones who trained him in the art of war. He turned then to Lord Krishna, who sat with him in his chariot. Arjuna's eyes filled with tears, and he shook his head, saying, I would be forever ashamed, Krishna, if I were to kill my kith and kin. I could never find any satisfaction in such slaughter. Though their bows are drawn to kill, to slay these people would be a sin. So what if they're evil? They're my relatives. How could I ever again be happy? I know that they are blind to the evil in all their treachery. But does that justify me being blind to Krishna? If these same relations attack me and kill me, unresisting and unarmed on this battlefield, so be it. Death would be better for me. He flung his bow and arrow to the floor of his chariot and said, I cannot fight. I was 7 when my parents first told me the story of the Mahabharata and described this dialogue between Krishna and Arjuna. Arjuna had my sympathy. I couldn't imagine facing my family, my blood relatives in battle and being told to kill them to save the world. I thought he was right to refuse to fight. After all, ahimsa, nonviolence, was a core belief in Hinduism. And wouldn't killing be violent? Especially the killing of his own relatives? So I remember my surprise when my father told me that Lord Krishna, instead of extolling Arjuna's restraint, challenged it. He told Arjuna he was looking at this situation all wrong. And Lord Krishna said, you may grieve sincerely, Arjuna, but it is without cause. Your words may seem wise, but the truly wise grieve neither for the living nor the dead. There has never been a time where I or you or any of these kings and soldiers did not exist, and there will be never a time that they cease to exist. Physical bodies appear and disappear, but not the Atma, the soul, the life force that lives within them. This life force comes and it dwells in the body for a little while. While it's here, it experiences infancy, childhood, youth, and old age, and then, upon death, passes into a new body. Changes such as death pertain to the body, not the Atma. The wise person does not get caught up in the delusion that he or she is this body. Throughout the 200 pages of the Gita, also known as the Song of God, Krishna explains to Arjuna that the purpose of a human birth is to understand who we really are, the true self within us, which is God. There is a difference between what endures and what does not, between who we really are and who we think we are. The true self, the Atma that lives within us, makes us each an embodiment of God, and because God is love, we are each an embodiment of love. And who we really are, therefore, remains unaffected by worldly changes. In the words of Krishna himself, who we are is not wounded by weapons. It is not burned by fire or dried out by the wind or made wet by water. But many of us believe that the things around us make us who we are. Our bodies, our minds, our relationships, our jobs. But each of these changes, and everything in this world that changes, Krishna tells Arjuna, is unreal. Death, therefore, is especially terrifying if we believe that our existence and who we are ends when the body dies when the body dies. But when the body falls, Krishna told Arjuna, it is the spirit, the Atma, that remains standing. Therefore, Lord Krishna said, because death stirs humanity to seek answers to important spiritual questions, it becomes the greatest servant of humanity rather than its most feared enemy. It is true, and a truism often said, that dying and thinking about dying and having an awareness of dying teaches us much about what it means to live and to live well. But I want to try to push us one level deeper beneath that often repeated saying. Because what pulses beneath the fact of death is the fact of suffering. And suffering in its various forms precedes death, but suffering also exists apart from death and dying. We identify ourselves with things that are impermanent, things that change. Our bodies, our professions, our relationships and accomplishments. And each of these things can bring great joy and deep disappointment, because each of these things is ultimately impermanent, subject to change. And expecting things to remain permanent when they are not is the root of suffering. Death happens to be the starkest example of this. But how would our lives be different if we began to engage with and understand our suffering? How might we live differently if we came to understand the difference between the real and the unreal, the things that endure and the things that don't in our everyday lives? What grace and softness might become a part of our lives if we honor rather than resist the fleeting nature of things? Could the contemplation of suffering and impermanence open us more widely to the wonder of our lives and the world around us? Could it, in fact, help us to see ourselves in each other and move closer to an understanding of human unity? As I treated Andrew's pain, he and I talked about his life. He had grown up on an island, married the woman he'd loved since they were children, kissed her after their wedding in a sea that surrounded them, her lips slick with gloss and brine. He had 2 children. His parents lived 1 street away from them. He loved jazz and bird watching, rainstorms, and the glassy ocean the day after them. Cancer in his 30s, cancer that broke through his cheek, had never been part of the plan. Neither was the feeding tube, nor the way that every time he smiled, he felt like a hot knife was slicing through his face. Because Andrew could talk to me when his pain was better controlled, we started to talk about the things that he was most afraid of. I'm afraid that I will die in worse pain than I could ever imagine, he told me. And when we broke beneath the layer of the physical symptoms he was afraid of, he told me what really pulsed beneath so many of his actions and the decisions he'd been making. I'm afraid to leave my family. I'm ashamed that I'm so sick. I'm so ashamed also that I am not strong enough to get more chemotherapy. Those of you in the audience who may have lived with cancer yourselves or known those who have experienced cancer know that a lot of the times we can only give chemotherapy if the body is strong enough to receive it. But so much of the way we talk about being strong enough to get more chemotherapy has very much to do with whether the person has made the effort to get strong enough to get more chemotherapy. And part of what it meant to work with Andrew and really dig into the layers of shame was that we started to talk about what it meant to live in his body. He told me that he did not want to look in mirrors anymore, ever again, if he could avoid it. He wanted simply to know that, or he wanted a way of coping that though he may not be able to look in mirrors, that he would die this way with this disfigured self that would be the final memories he thought his family would have of him. Tell me about your suffering, I said to Andrew, which is a sentence that I had never known to ask when I was learning to become a doctor. And although he told me a lot about the layers of shame and the physical discomfort and his feeling like he simply hadn't tried hard enough, and that's why he couldn't get stronger, I asked him something. I said, Andrew, what if what you're going through has nothing to do with you, or how hard you are fighting, or how much you want to live for your family? What if it has to do with your body reaching a limit, your body not being strong enough, and has nothing to do with how much you want to live? And I was able to get to this point with him after several days of intense and deep conversation in which he was able to tell me all of the things about him that made him who he is, all of the things about his life, the things that I just talked to you about that made him a full and living and loving human being. But when I said to him, what if this has nothing to do with you? What if it has everything to do with the limits of biology? What if the home you live in right now is the place you were given to be a father and a husband and to live on an island and to make this world sparkle brighter, but it is not ultimately who you are? There's no way in my training that I could have ever thought to be brave or bold enough to go there, because I thought, number one, I didn't think that I could go there because, again, the mission that I had been trained to carry out had everything to do with saving his body, not necessarily talking about the difference between who he is and what his body looked like or the limits it was coming up against. And the only reason I think I had been able to go there with him was because I had learned to go on a journey years before I met him about learning the difference between who I really am and the impermanent things around me. It's hard to see change in ourselves, and it's hard to contemplate what change will come next and what it will mean for our lives and for our bodies. But what if we start by contemplating the small changes around us that are actually the biggest changes? I started to look outside my window and to see that the flowers that my neighbor planted were incredibly gorgeous, which I had always seen, but I started to really notice as the seasons turned what happened to those flowers. I started to notice the way the roses that I thought were incredibly gorgeous, and which I, as a failed gardener, should not be allowed ever to tend to plants, but I can operate a ventilator, so there's that. But I started to notice how much the change of the flowers ultimately actually bothered and saddened me. I started to slow down. I started to smell the proverbial roses, but also to feel the petals and to feel how they changed week after week as the seasons turned. I started to recognize and really examine how it made me feel when I observed these little losses. I started to observe what it feels, and I still do this every day, when I put my hands on my dog and feel where his coat has started to thin, or look at where his whiskers are turning gray. And instead of judging it, I just sit with it. And that small practice that I do has helped me in big and small ways to welcome change and to understand that the more I resist the little and the big changes in my life, the more I suffer. Because everything around me that I hold dear is going to change, whether it's within me or within my neighbor's soil or within the people I love and the people I will love in the future. This doesn't mean that I don't feel grief or fear or loss. It doesn't mean that I tell my patients you should not feel grief or fear or loss or shame about the immense changes you're going through. But it does mean that we learn to be with those changes differently. Because maybe if we can be with the turn of seasons differently, maybe we can learn to be with the small and the big changes within and around us differently. In this way, maybe we could also learn to live more fully by understanding how it feels when we stop resisting and we start understanding the resistance as the root of suffering, and we move into a place where we can see that what makes things beautiful is their transience. What makes the spring, and the fall, and the rain, is that it's there and then it goes. And what would it be like if we can welcome the rain knowing the sun will come? What would it be like to welcome death knowing that it's not always the end? Loss is a bright line that blazes through each of our lives, casting shadows and conferring clarity. But what I am coming to understand is that everything we think is ours to lose was not ours to begin with. What happens when we start to understand this, when we open to the idea that we are vaster than we think we are? Jane Hirshfield, a Buddhist poet with a beautiful sensibility, writes about what lasts and what does not, what it means to know the difference between the two. And she writes, "It was like this. You were happy, then you were sad, then you were happy again, then not. It went on. You were innocent or you were guilty. Actions were taken or not. At times you spoke, at other times you were silent. Mostly it seems you were silent. What could you say? Now it is almost over. Like a lover, your life bends down and kisses your life. It does this not in forgiveness. Between you, there is nothing to forgive. But with the simple nod of a baker, at the moments he sees the bread is finished with its transformation. Your story was this. You were happy, then you were sad. You slept, you awakened. Sometimes you roasted chestnuts, sometimes persimmons." Andrew and I met with his family to talk about what he wanted to do next. Faith bound his family together, though each person in his family interpreted their common faith differently. His wife believed that the body was the Lord's gift, and fighting for every second of this sacred God-given life was how we honor this gift. His parents believed that trying every possible treatment demonstrated love for and commitment to one's family, and therefore to God. But his mother had also seen how much her son had suffered and privately told him that she was worried by how many times he'd been in the hospital with worsening pain. So we sat with his family one day, Andrew and I having talked about what he wanted to tell them after days of thinking about what it meant for him to be something other than the form in which he suffered. They gathered by his bedside, and I sat next to them. The table he used for meals had a picture of Jesus propped up against a pink plastic water pitcher, and there was a rosary around it. And I watched as a child told his parents that he was ready to die. "I don't want to do this anymore," he said to them. "I don't want to do this anymore, not because I don't love you, but because I know our love is never going to die. I will always be with you anyway. God will simply give me a new body. I will never leave you. I will wait for you." And I watched in wonder, with awe, that this person who was in his 30s, around my age at the time, was parenting his parents as they were losing him. It's very hard for me, by the way, to talk about the story without tearing up a little bit, because it was so moving and so arresting to watch somebody do this, to come in the span of a few days of understanding that who he is and who he always was, simply because our team allowed him to tell us who he was, that he could pronounce the difference between who he is and the broken body through no fault of his own in which he lived. He told me later that dropping his resistance to the inevitable helped him to see more clearly who he was, who he would continue to be, and who he always was, and who his parents always were. And this is the gift of being able to doctor at the deathbed and at the bedside, at all the beds that will lead towards the final resting place of my patients, that I get to see the possibility that awaits us if we can open ourselves to the idea that who we are is not where we live, or how much money we have, or the money we'll leave behind, or the number of lines on our CV, or who loves us and who hasn't. Being with impermanence is a type of mercy for ourselves and the people we love. Embracing impermanence and understanding what is real and what is not is the most important journey in a human life, according to the Hindu scriptures. But this is a process, a new lens through which we see our lives, the events that unfold around and within us, and the people we love. It's a way for us to understand ourselves and emotions and others anew, as well as the connections that make us human. I have not mastered what I am sharing with you today. I am often, I think as many of us are, the agent of my own suffering. I am the one who at various points in my life have declared myself not enough in innumerable ways. Sometimes I told myself I didn't have a partner because I wasn't lovable enough. I didn't do well on the important test because I wasn't smart enough. A magazine didn't take an essay I wrote, and so I thought, I am not a good writer. Then a partner came along and suddenly I was lovable. Suddenly I was pretty. I published an essay in the magazine and suddenly I was the best writer. The highest score on the physiology test, and I was the best medical student ever to walk the earth. I was, I thought, only as much as the validation I received. I was what I achieved, and this is how I defined myself for so long. But all of these things contain within them the seed of their own destruction. And when the relationship ended, or the magazine said no, or the test score wasn't that great, then what was I? This is why Andrew blamed himself for the cancer and his inability to receive more chemo. This is why Arjuna lay down his weapons, overcome with anguish and guilt, at the idea that his God-given duty to kill his own flesh and blood so that good may triumph over evil. All of us were still learning, as Krishna said, the difference between what is permanent and what is not, the difference between who we really are and who we think we are, who the world has somehow taught us that we are. That which is real never dies. None of us knew who we really were, or who others were, or how deeply connected we were to them, even when they appeared to be the enemy or the cause of our distress. I didn't yet know that what it would mean to doctor in this way would mean to see that my pain is no different than the people I take care of. It is in these moments that I try to remember what Krishna said many centuries ago to Arjuna as he nearly stepped away from the battle that would have meant the world would have been destroyed. The Atma, the real us, was never born, nor will it ever die. In fact, this eternal reality within us is never destroyed. It never undergoes any changes. When your ego takes over and you erroneously identify with the body, you feel that physical death is death to the self, and that is frightening. But the self can never be killed. When the body is slain, who you are remains unaffected. At this level of comprehension, there is no slaying and no causing another to slay. The cessation of your pain and sorrow will depend on how well you overcome your ignorance of the true self that lives within you. This doesn't take away grief, it doesn't take away mourning, and it doesn't take away the things that make us human. It just offers another way. It is through the contemplation of impermanence and its relationship to suffering that I have come to see myself as no different from my patients. I have come to see that though I may grieve everything I have lost and will lose just as they will, that this is perfectly human. I am not my suffering, and neither are they. Neither is Andrew, and neither are you. When I sit with it, when I learn to loosen my grip on everything that I have tried to hold tightly, I open to the wonder of being alive, to knowing that no matter when my life changes next or when I die, I will return to a place I never left, to a magnificence where I will one day meet my patients, where I will meet my ancestors. It is the same magnificence that we all occupy now together, treasuring this moment, knowing that because it is impermanent, it is gorgeous. Thank you.